Hey everybody, it's Leica. I wanted to talk to you today about trans-exclusionary radical feminism. And I'm going to try not to go into it too much because what I want to focus on is whether TERF, T-E-R-F, trans-exclusionary radical feminist, is a slur. So very briefly, the definition of radical feminism I like is feminism that, one, has a viewpoint that is more progressive than average, and two, is activist in nature, so it effects real social change, or works to anyway. And it's important to note that radical feminism is actually not a bad thing at all. First wave feminism in the United States was radical in nature and very necessary and helpful. So I just want to make sure that I mention that I actually support a lot of radical feminist politics. So within radical feminist groups, there are sometimes some very vocal opinions about transgender persons. This is not just limited to trans women. We see it about non-binary persons or NBs, where people will say, "Oh, we don't want, NBs to go in women's spaces," or we don't validate NB's identity because we don't believe that gender is anything but binary. We see things about trans men that are contributing towards arguably erasure of trans male identities, such as people saying that, oh, we need to prevent children from being able to identify as trans in any fashion, because then young lesbians will all just identify as trans men, and that'll lead to lesbian erasure. That's an opinion we see. So I just want to make sure I mention that those things are out there. But most of my observations and experience interacting with this group has been when it comes to trans women, because I'm a transgender woman. So really quick, what is a slur, right? So a slur can be something which starts off as a derogatory term, but it doesn't have to be, right? And that is the case for sometimes different religious groups or ethnic groups. It's happened in the United States where there were terms that were not originally derogatory terms used to refer to groups of people, but due to the way that those terms were used, became oppressive, and so they became slurs. So it's important to note that a slur doesn't just start as a derogatory term. So did TERF start as a derogatory term, right? And from what I've read on this, is it really didn't. There were radical feminist groups who were advocating to exclude trans women mostly from the platform of feminism, because they wanted to fight for women's rights, but not for trans women's rights. They specifically wanted to not include trans women in the group of women whose rights they were fighting for. This type of phenomenon is not just limited to excluding trans people. You also see, for example, sometimes radical feminists with the opinion that any commercial depictions of sex or marketing of human sexuality to the male gaze is inherently degrading or dehumanizing to women, so they are sex worker exclusionary radical feminists, and they advocate for the destruction of pornography, for the rescue of prostitutes and any sort of adult entertainers. And you see this sort of thing not just limited to trans exclusion. But I don't need to get into sex worker exclusion today, and obviously I'm going to be a little bit biased here, but I am an adult entertainer, so I don't tend to fall into that camp, although I agree that you can definitely exploit a group of people via their sexuality, and that has happened to women a lot. Topic for another video, but I don't think that porn is inherently evil and etc. So, but when it comes to trans-exclusionary radical feminist politics, um, kind of the question is, does it make sense to label those politics as a group or to label the people who have those politics? Um, and I would argue yes, because the way that that ideology is used, the way that it's converted into propaganda, is especially damaging to transgender persons who are an oft victimized group, right? And I would like to think that transgender persons would be just as equally deserving of the same dignity as cisgender persons. But not everybody feels that way, and um, what comes up a lot of times in this type of thing is like these arguments for women's safety, and a lot of times statistics will be manipulated to make trans people appear violent. And it's true that every group of people is going to have violent people in it, right? But I have not found any indication in anything that I've studied that trans people are more violent than cisgender people. If anything, they seem to be slightly less violent. So I don't think that that's a very good argument. But at any rate, those kind of statistics get parroted, and since a lot of people don't have a solid understanding of statistics or how studies are done or how statistics are generated and what statistics mean, it's very easy for numbers to sound convincing. So a lot of this stuff gets pushed around, and people buy into it. And so we end up with a lot of people who are very vocal about the idea of safety in women's spaces. A lot of these people are within radical feminist groups or identify as having rad fem politics. And so they will really try to fight for trans women to not have access to safe spaces. Other trans people too, not just trans women, but especially trans women. And they will actively push for legislation that is discriminatory towards transgender persons. And they will try to educate people about gender in ways that are incorrect. And that's, again, probably would be a topic for another video about, like, what is the nature of gender. But there's a lot that's known about gender. There's a lot that's unknown about gender. But they like to apply a reductionist mentality to it in ways that are damaging to people that don't fit the gender binary, that aren't cisgender, that are not heteronormative. And sometimes those politics and mentalities actually are damaging to cisgender queer people. So I'm not sure really what the objective is there. But at any rate, like we have this stuff that gets used as weapons against trans people, especially trans women, and I think it makes sense to be able to look at that and say that is what that is, and to have a word for it, right? And words have utility when they can be used to identify and categorize things. Because if we can say, okay, so that is what that is, now we know, well, we can come up with a strategy for that because we have a category for that, and we can come up with ideas based on that. For example, we can do better gender education, and we can support trans youth. We can do all those kinds of things, useful strategies in the face of that kind of ideology. So I think it's useful to be able to categorize that and have a word for it. The question is that word a slur? And very briefly, a slur does not have to start as a derogatory term. right? Um, in a lot of places in the world, but I know in the history of the United States, there are terms that have been used for religious or ethnic groups that um, did not start as derogatory terms. They were just descriptive, or they were euphemisms that were not necessarily intended to be derogatory, but they tended to get used in oppressive manners. And so over time, those things came to be slurs. So a slur is not just something that starts as a derogatory term, right? So I just want to make sure that, like, I want to acknowledge that, and I want to say that, if a group of people say, hey, this word, this term, this phrase is oppressive, it's worth listening to that voice. Even if the person saying that also tells me that I'm trash and not valid as a human, I'm still willing to listen to their idea of, like, hey, well, that term is possibly oppressive. I'll still give that time of day. Um, so, kind of something to look at too is, has it been used oppressively? And you could argue that yes, it has, because there are people who uh, will, you know, call someone a TERF, and it's kind of meant as an insult, but that's not necessarily oppression, right? Because you can insult someone and say, like, hey, you're you have bad politics because you're excluding a vulnerable group of people, right? And someone can find that insulting, but it's not necessarily oppressive. Um, but it's also worth noting that there's kind of been this whole punch turfs thing. And I believe that some of what goes into that when a trans person makes a joke about punching turfs is trans people have often been on the receiving end of a lot of violence, and sometimes we look for ways to joke about that sort of thing, and it probably comes out in kind of a weird sideways way when trans people say things like that about punching turfs. But in the vast majority of cases, I don't think the trans person is actually intending any sort of violence towards anyone, especially women. That is not something I would ever advocate for, and no trans person I have met would advocate for that. So you kind of have to look at, well, is it artistic expression? And it possibly is, right? Because there are a lot of things about, punching that refer to artistic expression because they're metaphorical and they're not literal. But there has been a few cases where someone used the punch turfs theme and there was actual violence against women. Um, so, like, I'm very much not cool with that. Um, and that makes me not want to even joke about punching turfs because I don't want people to think that there's an actual threat of violence. I don't want people to have any doubt in their mind about whether that's metaphor and artistic expression or whether they have something to actually fear, right? Because that's not cool. It's just not. Um, so, like, I'm willing to give time of day to the idea that, well, maybe turf is a slur. I don't think it's reached that point yet, but I think it's worth listening to people who say that. And I may take flack for this. Um, I will probably get called true scum for this, even though I very much am against, like, the a lot of the people that have the true scum mentality. I do not side with them, believe me. But I am all about listening to people's voices, even if those people I don't think are necessarily very good people, at least when it comes to how they treat me. I don't know. Maybe I give people more time of day than I should. But it's important to listen to people's voices, right? And I think everybody has things they do that are not necessarily always nice, right? There's, I get random things in my inbox from guys online, and I ignore them a lot, and that's probably not nice to do, right? But I don't think that makes me a bad person. And so if there's a radical feminist who, they advocate trans women should not be in women's spaces, and maybe their experience or their understanding of trans is very different from mine, because they're not trans. It's maybe a little bit mean, but I don't think it would make them necessarily a bad person, right? So I would still want to give them time of day. And if someone is saying, like, well, hey, something is a slur, I think it's worth listening to. Now, I want to make sure that I'm, like, very much vocal about the fact that I don't support trans-exclusionary radical feminism in any way. I very much advocate for trans people to have freedom of expression and to have choice in how they transition. Like, I'm not in that true scum camp where you have to be trans enough and you have to be, passable, or you have to go through gatekeeping, or you have to play up gender stereotypes, because feminism is not about playing into gender stereotypes. Feminism is about breaking out of gender roles. It's about choosing how you express your gender and not having to conform to how women are supposed to be in terms of what they do and how they look and who they are. Right? So I want to make sure that nobody thinks I fall into the true scum camp. Although I'm sure I will get told that I do, because it's the internet, right? But so the question is, should we still use TERF as a term? And I keep playing with different ideas in my head for acronyms, and I really can't come up with anything. Right? I can come up with sort of a comic feminist against recognizing trans equality, which actually kind of has some worth to it, because trans people want true equality. We don't want separate but equal, right? Because that's just segregation against another group. We want true equality. We want, in the vast majority of cases, to just be seen and treated exactly the same as cisgender women, right? And for it to not be a big deal that we're trans, and for us to not be different somehow, right? And that's really what we want. So, but I really can't come up with something that's not comic to refer to trans-exclusionary radical feminist politics. Although I kind of like the idea of calling someone a fart, because a fart's unpleasant to be around, right? And I don't want to be around that person's politics. So feminist against recognizing trans equality, maybe not such a bad idea. But that it's still, calling someone a fart is it's that whole playful but still meant to be a little bit derogatory. So that would probably be kind of a slur. So we should stay away from that. But I kind of just wanted to make a video because I don't know that this is really getting said enough, that, just because a term is a descriptive term that wasn't meant to be a slur doesn't mean that it can't become a slur. I don't think TERF has become a slur, but I think it's important to recognize that it's useful to pay attention to how that term is getting used. And it's prudent to listen to the voices of the people that term is describing. And it may behoove us to come up with a better way of talking about this. And it would probably also behoove the trans community to get away from the punch TERFs idea. And I'm sure people are going to call me true scum for saying let's not use terms like punch TERFs. But anyway, that's, who knows? It's the internet, right? Well, that's really it. That's all I wanted to say. And if anyone actually watches this, which nobody will, I'm sure the comments will be full of stuff like, oh my god, you look like a boy, you sound like a man, ew, do you still have a penis, and all the other stuff that I've already heard hundreds of times. So seriously, come up with something better. Oh my god, right? People. Okay, that's it. Bye.